All right, we're gonna get started. Thanks everybody for joining the EDR and MDR and Binary Defense Division OMI webinar. Hopefully, we can keep this an open discussion too. Feel free to use the questions form at the bottom there, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you have as you go along. But this talk really is to kind of dive down into what we're seeing from what we call endpoint detection and response and a managed endpoint detection and response tools that are out there, as well as the capabilities, why they're useful, and how that plays into monitoring detection. For me, this is Dave Kennedy here. I'll go through a little bit of intro of binary defense and myself here in just a second. As someone that comes from more of the red side of it, understanding how attackers are getting access into environments and understanding, detection criteria, all of these are really important things for enterprises to have a good handle on. And that's really where the endpoint detection and response tools come into play. What you can do to build that into your environment, and how to actively leverage them to really, build your detection criteria out. Oh, a little bit further there. A little bit about binary defense. So this is Dave Kennedy here. I started binary defense a few years ago, and it was really with the vision of building a team of folks that I trust and that I work with on a regular basis to really, get in the early stages of attacks, to really detect attacks that are happening out there. And so we run a 24/7, 365 security operations center that focuses on the identification of advanced threats all the way to commoditized ransomware and everything else that you see out there today. But one thing that we'll be talking about today is our endpoint detection and response tool Vision, which is deployed to customers all over the world, and what it does and what it provides for us. I definitely want to make sure that I hit on other areas as well. We're not going to just do a complete vendor pitch here from a endpoint protection or endpoint detection piece. But really, our Vision platform is really designed by an awesome team. I work very, very much day in and day out with that team to, do a lot of the detection criteria and everything else. But a really cool way to, actively go and detect specific things that are happening. And I'll cover a little bit about that as we go along. So a little bit about myself. I'm Dave Kennedy. I started two companies, one called Binary Defense and the other around here today, and the other one is TrustedSec. I've had a very fortunate career. I started off working off in the United States military, in the Marine Corps, in the intelligence side, doing information warfare. Got out of there and was with a small consulting shop for a little while. And then from there went and was the chief security officer for Diebold, which is a Fortune 1000 company located in Canton, Ohio. I wrote the book Metasploit: The Penetration Tester's Guide. Also wrote the tool, the Social Engineer Toolkit. Started a conference with a bunch of friends called DerbyCon, and have helped before in the past on the Mr. Robot TV show. But most importantly in the experience and what we're talking about today is really understanding, what we can do to get better at detection and some of the challenges that we face out there, and some of the tools and technology that can, absolutely help you and leverage those and everything else. So. If you look at what we're seeing today, attackers change their what we call their tactics, techniques, and procedures on a regular basis. Whether that's leveraging ways of mimicking certain types of patterns of behavior, like using RFC compliant protocols, like if I'm an attacker going in and compromising an individual endpoint and then using DNS tunneling, or using reverse HTTPS as a method for command and control infrastructure. And then from there, we try to emulate other traffic, that is legitimate. The problem is that for defenders, unless we're keeping up to date on everything that's going on out there on a day-to-day basis, the attack patterns change over time, and different groups, leverage different things. If you're looking at more like state-sponsored adversaries, the techniques vary based off of the type of groups that you're working with. Same thing for organized crime. Heavy obfuscation versus binary droppers versus, macro injection versus PowerShell versus, application control bypasses. The techniques and the patterns change all the time, and that's always very difficult for us on the defender side to really have an understanding around what's actually happening out there. So a good example of that is there's application control bypasses that literally come out all the time. Ways of getting remote code execution onto systems, whether that's through that's through Registry 32 or other binaries that are out there. Attackers are coming up with different ways to actively go and find specific patterns. Just a good example today, just about an hour or two ago, GN Nemesis on Twitter found a Windows binary. It's mavinject32.exe. And with mavinject32.exe, which is a legitimate Windows binary, that is signed by Microsoft. You can just give it a specific process ID and then do a /inject running and then import any DLL you want to for remote code execution. So just found a couple hours ago, right? So that's a way of getting around what we call application whitelisting or application control. The problem with that, though, is that if you don't have a team that's fully dedicated at researching those and the ability to move very quickly, you're going to have a lot of problems. There was a few months ago where Sub-T Casey Smith came out with a method where you could use CertUtil, which is a legitimate Windows binary that is in the System32 directory, and there's a -ping flag that you can go and download code directly from the internet and execute it, off of the operating system for remote code execution through CertUtil. We saw a day after that was published, attackers were leveraging that for command and control and for remote code execution. So, this moves very, very fast, and if we don't detect these in the very early stages, attackers have the ability to maintain access in our environment for a larger period of time based off of those changing attack patterns. And so with endpoint detection and response, and what that means is that those tools are supposed to be designed to help you get those early warning detection criteria to really help you start to identify a lot of these attacks. And if you look at the pictures to the right, it's kind of like a maze when you're looking at all the information that's out there. You have maybe hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of assets that you have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. What's difficult with that is understanding what those patterns look like. What most companies struggle with is one budget. To maintain people is another. So how do you keep people that are talented in those individual areas to be able to research those, to be able to identify those specific attacks? Those are all key pieces that fall into what our problems are out there and the different types of attacks that we see. And so if you look at 2000 to now, what's interesting, and even going back into the 90s, what you look at from a technology perspective is that antivirus was traditionally our endpoint protection, what we used to respond to. And antivirus is an interesting concept. There's multiple things that make up the term, I guess, endpoint protection. But what's interesting about what made up antivirus traditionally was if there was a piece of malware or malicious software that was identified, what would happen is they would write a specific signature for that, and then that signature then would detect any type of hopefully any type of variation with that specific piece of code. But what's happened is the influx of different types of attacks, the ability to morph your techniques to be able to do obfuscation. A lot of things have changed to where obviously signatures are no longer a factor. Now the problem with that though is that there's new and creative ways. You hear the terms machine learning, artificial intelligence. You hear baselining and environmental behavior analysis. These are all techniques that are still very much signature based from a lot of cases. A good example is, let's just say an executable gets dropped onto a system. It's not code signed. It hasn't been seen before in a massive data set of pools that you see in the back end of these types of tools. And maybe it exhibits certain types of malicious behavior, command and control infrastructure, going and downloading something and spawning child processes. These are all things that is not 100% sure that it's malicious or not, but the type of behavior that it's exhibiting is definitely suspicious in nature. So if you look at traditional antivirus had to be right 100% of the time. They had to be able to flag on something that it knew or that the signature had seen before in the past. It technically couldn't really be wrong. So if you look at that and you say, okay, well, where are we at today? What's interesting today is that our model has changed to where we don't need to be 100% right all the time. If it's a weird pattern of behavior, if when we deconstruct a binary and it exhibits specific things that emulate what an attack would look like, those are things that we want to take a look at from a incident response perspective, or what the tool should be flagging on. In order for us to be able to detect. Another couple of good examples is PowerShell. A lot of focus has been on PowerShell from a exploitation perspective. You look at PowerShell Empire. You look at the tool that I wrote, Unicorn, which does PowerShell injection. PowerShell has been a huge focus of attack. The problem with PowerShell is it's a full-fledged programming language. So the ability to write code that doesn't exhibit abnormal patterns of behavior is definitely within the capabilities of someone that is proficient at PowerShell. Now the issue you start to run into, with PowerShell specifically, is that PowerShell itself is especially the newer versions of the PowerShell version 5 with script block logging, the integration into the anti-malware scan interface, AMSI. There's a lot of great things that PowerShell has given defenders the ability to do research. Now the question is, from 2000 to now, what we would typically do from a traditional endpoint protection product is you would take that and you'd look for specific strings, or you'd look for a specific variation. A good example is about 3 weeks ago. There was an update to Windows Defender, and Windows Defender started flagging on Unicorn, which is the tool that I wrote. And so I started looking at what Windows Defender was flagging on inside of Unicorn. And it took me, probably about 15-20 minutes, and I figured out that Windows Defender pushed an update that looked for a specific variable name that I forgot to randomize as I was doing the obfuscation of my code. So once I, minimized or randomized that variable name, I had no issues and got around antivirus. It wasn't a problem. Now the issue with that is, from a Windows Defender perspective, again, traditional antivirus need to be right 100% of the time. When it comes to the behavior that Unicorn's exhibiting, there's a lot of things inside of Unicorn, the length of the command, how it's operating, shellcode injection, allocating memory and injecting my own shellcode directly into memory, PowerShell itself now beaconing out directly to the internet. Those are all key things that we should be flagging off of from a suspicious behavior perspective and PowerShell usage, that if we don't have the right type of logging, the right type of people, and the right type of defenders, those types of attacks definitely go unnoticed. And that's a problem, getting the visibility that we need to. And that's why when you start looking at EDRs, we'll talk about this here in a few minutes, but most companies struggle with getting those logs off, being able to do centralization of Windows logging. I mean, Windows logging in general, if you enable the right Windows event logs, you do something like sysmon for like ETW or event log tracing, you have the ability to do some pretty heavy detection criteria off of a number of the attacks that are out there today. But getting those logs and then being able to understand what a malicious PowerShell command looks like, or what an application bypass looks like, or what remote code execution looks like, or lateral movement, or other things. These are things that become really challenging for defenders unless they focus on this on a day-to-day basis. Now this is an interesting statistic, and this is from Forbes. Every year in the United States, 40,000 jobs in information security analysts go unfilled, and employers are struggling to fill 200,000 other cybersecurity related roles, according to cybersecurity data tool CyberSeek. So this is no different news as far as what we're seeing out there, but information security is something that is a very difficult profession, because it's not information security is not an entry-level position. There are entry-level positions to get into information security and to build your knowledge. But you look at the skills that we need in order to do it. I mean, to be on the blue, it's not just being on the blue and understanding a specific tool. It's understanding, hey, what does remote code execution look like? What does a specific attack look like? Where do I need to research these types of things? What is malicious, what is not? And so on the blue side, there's many roles on the blue as well. This is one example on the defense. But in order to fill those roles, it's very difficult for traditional companies. Pay scales are crazy. It's a supply and demand. You have somebody that's good at security, they're going to get gobbled up in most cases to another organization. So maintaining talent inside of organizations also becomes an issue. Being able to have people report to you on a regular basis that understand these types of capabilities and keep those people is definitely a challenge. So you look at another struggle too. We all have protection in some way, shape, or form, whether that's traditional antivirus or we're using application whitelisting. There's a number of things that we can define as protection. Firewalls, next generation firewalls, intrusion prevention systems, good user provisioning and user rights management, so not everybody's administrators. There's layers of protection, two-factor authentication, et cetera, et cetera. The issue with protection that we face, and this is where the detection criteria comes into a big discussion point, is that protection takes time to implement. If you're doing application whitelisting, to roll that out to an organization can take years of properly doing things. And in best case scenario, you're looking at several months at least. So from an application whitelisting perspective, it takes a long time. To lock things down even further, when a new attack comes out, we have to go and do different things, like maybe lock down a specific binary or a specific process. That can take weeks or months to go and actively do. So let's just say we see a new attack vector that's come out. I just mentioned the mabinject32.exe that you can use for remote code execution earlier. With that one specifically, how long is that going to take for protection to get into place to where we're not going to allow that executable to either never run, or B, build detection in place so that if a process ever gets spawned with that, we have the ability to go and detect off of it. And so that's the gap, right? Is we can put protection in, and we should always be working on getting better protection. And I'm a huge advocate of application whitelisting. I think it is one of the most refined and the best ways to reduce specific attacks. I mean, a lot of the things we could do just by removing non-code signed executables from running in user profile directories would literally reduce a large percentage of what you're seeing out there as far as general infections. So if you can at least get to application whitelisting in some way, shape, or form based on your environment, you have a good level of protection there. Now, there's always going to be bypass techniques, and that's where the detection components come into play. So it's really important to understand that detection has to be a large component of everything that you're doing. So protection, we know it's going to lag behind. We're going to continue to make it as good as possible, but we're not exactly sure when we're going to get better on or when we're going to be able to implement the specific protective control. So we have to have detection. And so detection's hard. It requires advanced understanding of what we call the tactics, techniques, and procedures, the TTPs. It's a great buzzword that everybody uses, but I truly believe in it. The tactics of an attacker, the techniques an attacker leverages, and the procedures that they operate by. Those are all important things. Are we going to use an RFC compliant command and control? Is it going to do a reverse shell over DNS? What does that look like? How do they move laterally? Are you going to use DCOM for lateral movement? Are we going to be using SMB and RPC for lateral movement? What does that look like? What's their MO, standard operating methods of how they conduct remote code execution or post-exploitation? These are all key things that, as defenders, if we don't have a good concept of, we will probably never see these types of attacks that are happening in our environment. And granted, I mean, again, there's a wide range of it. I mean, you have 80% or 80 or 90 and 95% is noise, right? You have your ransomware campaigns. You have traditional binaries that are getting dropped. You have your drive-bys, things that are trying to harvest wire transfer information like TrickBot. So you look at a lot of the different commoditized stuff, and we may not need to have a vast understanding. But where you start to see a lot of the gray area start to happen is when there's ability to actively attack a company and go after specific things and take a large copious amounts of data and not get detected. I mean, we've seen that with a number of companies this year, and I'm sure we'll see plenty of those happening again next year. And so really the detection piece really becomes the hard component, because you really start to look at hey, what do I need to flag on? What do we need to trigger on? There's so much data happening out there. What do I go and do? A good example of that too is PowerShell. PowerShell, if you're using something like encoded command, there's I think 16 different variations of encoded command. Like you can do -E, you can do -EC, you can do -EN, ENC, et cetera, et cetera. Instead of leveraging things like that, well, what if we looked at PowerShell and say, okay, well, we're going to baseline people or processes that are happening for PowerShell that beacon out to the internet. We're going to see every time PowerShell goes and beacons out to the internet, and we're going to baseline our environment to say, okay, well, we know these IP addresses or these host names are going to be used by these specific business processes, but if we see PowerShell beaconing out something we haven't seen before, well, that's something we should probably investigate. That's probably something we should look at and learn. And so the detection piece of it is something that's hard and requires a vast amount of time, but it also is something that if we understand what an attacker is doing, that's when we start to come into play, and things that we can do that starts to become fun. And I talked a little about this before, but the endpoint protection products that are out there today, they really struggle with keeping up to date. And that's why you've seen a lot of EDR companies get gobbled up and acquired, because there's a big gap in between there. Now, it's interesting because you look at the suite of antivirus products or things that are out there that tout the endpoint protection pieces. It's a whole mixture of a bunch of things together. You have your firewall components, you have your heuristics, you have your network analysis components, your intrusion prevention systems, your HIPs and your HIDs, and so all of these components kind of make up what we call our endpoint protection products today. The truth of the matter is if you look at how traditional exploitation is occurring, we look at, let's just say, a regular user. Regular user gets phished, or they're going to a website that has a drive-by. And code gets executed on the machine. Now, when that code actually gets executed on the machine, there's a number of things that happen. One is based on the technique, maybe an executable gets dropped, maybe a command is run, and then from there, additional code is either downloaded or maybe that code is self-contained, and then it beacons out through the firewall, reverse out to the internet to the attacker's machine or their infrastructure, their platforms that they're using. in that period of time, if your endpoint protection product doesn't detect those specific components, you're really, really hurting. And the reason for that is once you start moving to other situations, such as hash extractions, process injection, moving to different systems, this is where endpoint protection products really start to fail at. If they don't detect that initial entry point. And that's really when the EDR market really started, was not necessarily caring about the initial compromise point. It's something we definitely wanted to detect on, but if we don't, are there other weird patterns of behavior or strange indicators that we can leverage to notify us in the event that something is amiss or something's wrong? And that's really where the EDR market is positioning. Now there's a big mixture of it. I mean, you have folks that are in the protection space that are getting in the EDR market and vice versa. It's kind of a interesting area right now that's happening, but really it's one of those things where it's really one of those things where you can definitely help out getting a lot of detection. So if you look at some of the current challenges, one, with EDR specifically, putting another agent onto your desktop is something that's always a fun and exciting endeavor. You got to go through testing. It seems like everybody's going through and doing different things. Those are the types of things that are difficult in our environment to get agents put on. Log centralization is also tough. You look at Windows Event Forwarding, Snare, OSSEC HIDs. Those are some methods of getting centralization of logging. But once you have those logs, and let's talk a little about SIEMs here. If you look at security information event monitoring systems, SIEMs were really designed to be kind of what we consider EDRs today. So log consolidation from firewalls, routers, switches, operating systems, the dump site for all of your logs. Think of it as where all of your centralization of information goes. The issue with that is you have all this data. What do you do with it now? And that's talking about the historical challenge that we have in information security. Having a dedicated team that all they do is focus on log centralization, what normal use cases are, deviations from that. What do we look for as far as general attack patterns? Those are all things that SIEMs were supposed to accomplish. So when you look at that specifically, SIEMs have been a real difficult challenge for most organizations. Pretty heavy investment, and something that requires a substantial amount of resources and effort to go and actively do. And don't get me wrong, SIEMs can definitely help out an organization, but getting those logs centralized and all that information getting sent back at a given day-to-day period becomes a real difficult challenge. And then building detection of that behavior, understanding the attacks, and you'll see this as a common theme, and I'll talk a little bit about why EDRs really help out. But it's a very common theme of understanding those attacks. This is not something that is traditional signature-based components. These are direct attacks that are happening in your infrastructure, and do you have the capabilities, or does your SIEM have the capabilities of actively going and doing it? So you look at what endpoint protection products are really going after. The first thing is signatures, right? Still to this day, predominantly having signatures, going in and releasing signatures, having those pushed down. Second, code signing, that's a big one. One of the funniest tricks that I used to use as an attacker all the time, and it still works to this day to some, but not many at all anymore. But what we used to be able to do with most antivirus products out there, and this stopped probably around 2013 or 14, is when you can use those. But what you could do is you could extract a code signing cert, a digital signature, from a legitimate binary, let's just say a Microsoft signed binary, and then you could incorporate them and send them into your own malicious executable. Now, obviously, the checksums and everything would not match, and it would show an invalid digital signature. But when antivirus products would go to actually scan those, they wouldn't care. They would just say, "Oh, it's legit. Okay, it's code signed. I'm not going to check the signature of it." Since then, they've got a little bit smarter of that. But if you don't have a code signed executable, as an example, in most cases, it's going to rate you reputationally higher. So as an attacker, leveraging code signing on executables usually gets you a pretty good clip of getting over the threshold of being detected or not for those specific products. But what's also interesting too is if you look at general behavior of specific applications, there's certain things that definitely emulate specific types of attacks. PowerShell being out to the internet, but leveraging certain known commands. Like if I'm using IEX or invoke expression, if I'm using a coded command, if I'm using I invoke expression with download string as a parameter, I'm going out to a site and downloading things. Those are all key things that would traditionally maybe spit out some malicious behavior. So that's really where kind of the market is today, though, is looking for those predominant signature bases. Now they may claim heuristics and things like that. They're still very much focused off of a lot of the traditional methods of detection. So you look at the EDR focuses, and I think there's a question out there too. There's a question that I'll read out because I think it plays well within these specific areas here. But it says, it seems everyone has endpoint protection products these days. How do you differentiate EDR products in today's market? And that's a great question. When you look at endpoint protection products, I think they're very different from endpoint detection and response tools. Endpoint protection products are really to give you a baseline of protection. And a lot of EDRs are building in protection into their tools as well, and vice versa. So when you look at what you need to accomplish off of an EPP tool that maybe has EDR components in it, it's really evaluating how they do detection if their protection fails. And we'll talk a little about that and what that means, and ways that you can kind of baseline your environment and look at those types of tools to go through those. But let's talk a little about the EDR focus. The initial compromise method, for endpoint detection response tools may or may not get detected. And what I say about that is, most, including vision, will detect things that are dropping onto the system itself. And command and control infrastructure, DNS exfiltration, you name it. It'll definitely flag on suspicious behavior that's happening in the environment. But really, where EDR products play, and this, think of it as sensors for your entire network around post exploitation. When you start looking at deviations of what an attacker does, an attacker has to do certain things on a system that exhibits abnormal patterns of behavior. They have to. There's no way to emulate a regular user 100% of the time. And so what EDRs are really designed to do is look for those deviations of patterns, look for those weird patterns of behavior that are happening in your environment. So a good example is process tree deviations. Why is winword.exe now spawning child processes with service host and then from there calling PowerShell command.exe? That is a very basic example, but something that if someone is doing macro injection to leverage PowerShell calls, something you should never see in your environment. Now, what's important about that is that's the initial detection foothold. But think about if I'm going after credentials. I need to inject into LSAS, or maybe I need to extract specific registry keys in order to get the SAM database to dump. There are definite techniques that attackers can leverage, but they are all things that you don't typically see on a regular basis. So if you're looking at things like, hey, common attack methods. Okay, maybe we're using PowerShell. Maybe command line arguments, visual, VB script. There's a number of methods that we might use for common attack methods. But those attack vectors themselves, the process injection components, the extraction of clear text passages out of memory via Mimikatz using wdigest, those are all abnormal patterns of behavior. Hey, why is volclide.dll being imported in and leveraged while doing process injection to another process? Those are weird patterns of behavior that is something that you will not typically see in a regular environment. Same thing for lateral movement. Now lateral movement is one of the toughest because you have lateral movement happening all the time in your environment. Whether it's somebody in the help desk or a service account or normal business processes of just going from one system to the next, lateral movement happens all the time. But the most important piece about that is that it shouldn't happen, and you shouldn't have major deviations all the time. And so with lateral movement, there are definitely key components you can look for. And what I like about some EDRs, and what I like about ours, obviously, and I'm biased in that front, but looking at how lateral movement is working is kind of the math and science behind everything. And that's what I love about these types of things. Lateral movement, if you're focusing on a very specific type of lateral movement, like maybe somebody's using DCOM, maybe somebody's using pass to hash or PSExec as a method. Maybe someone's using PowerShell remoting. There's a number of methods that you can use for lateral movement from one system to the next. Granted, good security principles, you should probably stop, workstation to workstation communication, especially over like RPC and NetBIOS. But that's just me. You should definitely stop intercommunication traffic between those, especially in the lower level protocols. So 135, 445, and 139 probably shouldn't be allowed between multiple systems. But hey, if you still have that, that's understandable. But if you look at let's just say I'm Bob in marketing, and all of a sudden Bob on marketing's machine logs in via network, so login type 3 to a different system, and then from there move from that system to the next system. That's lateral movement, right? That may be a legitimate business process, but those are things that we should definitely investigate when we're going through and actively doing these types of things as far as investigations are concerned and looking for lateral movement in our environment. It's really, really important. And then you look at certain things like going and downloading specific types of data and possible ways of getting remote code execution. These are just examples, and this one is from our Security Operations Center here. This is probably not legit, right? Because you have PowerShell calling no profile, which means don't prompt a command window box to the victim. Exec bypass, or bypassing the execution restriction policies. And then from there, we're going and downloading a specific file with an MDF extension, and we're going to be saving it in the user's app data as teh.exe. And then we're going to start that as a start process, and then we're going to download some more information after that. So in this specific case, probably not something legitimate. But if we're not triggering, and this is where I actually have a lot of problems with a lot of the EDRs today in the market, is the EDR market will look for things like -NOP, -exec bypass, but they don't look at other things like, hey, why is somebody downloading a specific file? Why is PowerShell beaking out to the internet? This is an abnormal pattern of behavior. Hey, a PowerShell process going and downloading an executable is something that we need to go and actively investigate. And that's where these EDR components really help you out. This one's from Daniel. I'm a huge fan of him and everything he does over at FireEye Mandiant. Good guy. Daniel, recently saw this in the wild. I think this was from a VirusTotal feed or whatnot. But in this specific one, you can see he's pulling it from Sysmon, which is cool. Sysmon's great stuff. If you look at what's happening here, what's cool about this is they're using the certutil method for, so you see there certutil-ping to go and download and execute a file via PowerShell. But what's interesting about it is the PowerShell command never actually goes and executes anything network related. So it's going and certutil is going and downloading a specific file from the internet, and then PowerShell is going and actively leveraging that. So it's a good technique for obfuscation, but if you're not looking for certutil as an example beaconing out to the internet, or certutil going and executing a specific process, or command line argument logging, you're going to have some issues actively going and finding these types of things. And that's where obfuscation it starts to become kind of easy to spot, but if you're not having the right information sent centrally, you're going to miss this type of stuff. Your antivirus products, your endpoint protection products are definitely not going to be seeing this. So this is where you start to run into some challenges with the current technology that you're leveraging as far as limitations. And so if you look at this one specifically, think to yourself, would I have detected this being executed in my environment? And if not, what do I need to do to actively go and do that? Because this is an attack that was actively leveraged in the wild. It's one that is actively out there, and it's one that you probably don't have a lot of coverage on from actual detection. This one specifically is from Copter. So if you're not familiar with Copter, it's a click fraud piece of ransomware in a sense. What it does is once it compromises a machine, there is replication components for certain ones. And what it does, and this is a pretty neat one, it'll embed itself into multiple registry entries. It doesn't actually write any files to disk, so it doesn't actually drop an executable or a binary or anything else. And then you can see here in the current version run, it's calling MSHTA. Now, if you're not familiar with what MSHTA is, it's a legitimate Windows application for high-content HTML files. You can actually, if you have a .hta file exposed on the internet, it'll actually have a prompt up that's very similar to like ActiveX or Java applets. That when you open it up, it'll allow you to execute whatever you want to. VBScript, ActiveX components, whatever you want to execute. And it'll give the attacker the ability to execute whatever code they want to via this. Now, you see that very common in drive-bys, and infection methods. But in this case, what they were using is they already had access to the system, and it can be through, this one specifically was through macros through Excel. But in this specific one here, what they're doing is they're using the registry entries, so every time the person restarts their computer, we'll go and call MSHTA with this ActiveX component, which is wscript.shell, which is going to execute a shell command. And then from there, it's going to go and read a registry entry from a specific location that has the commands it needs to execute. And so in this case, you're never, ever dropping a binary on a system. You're never running a file to the system. These are things that are going to be embedded directly into your registry, and if you're not monitoring specific things like, hey, why is mshta.exe beaking out the internet, or why are we seeing registry injection techniques in current version run that we haven't seen before? These are things that you're going to miss, and a lot of people will not actively go and detect because of attackers shifting their techniques on a regular basis. So why are EDRs important? It gives you immediate detection into areas you typically have no visibility into. And when I say typically have no visibility into, again, you might be sending some of this to your SIM. I have no idea. This information may be getting there from your event logs. But do you know that if this specific registry version or this specific registry entry is getting changed with this version of MSHTA, you're actively going to see that, and it's going to be bubbled up to where you're going to be able to actively go and respond. And so that's the important component around where EDR is really supposed to play at. If you look at Vision, our platform, we're running at about 42 megs of RAM, 0.01 CPU usage, and about 3 megabytes per day per endpoint. And that gives you the ability to not impact the endpoints themselves, so low weight, and it's really easy to implement. And so that's an important piece of it is not this 1 gig install file that increases a bunch of things that are on your computer. It's something that is huge. And so that's the EDR piece. Now, when I talk about EDRs, there's also what we call MDRs and managed services. Now, if you look at this is from Gartner, the MSS market grew 10% in 2016, reaching 9.4 billion in revenue. The market has continued to its strong growth trajectory, driven by a mix of established and emerging providers, technology security planner, blah, blah, blah. So Gartner's basically saying that the managed services market is going to continue to grow as well. And so interesting with that, if you look at what I talked about before, and I'm kind of trying to all put it all together, is that most companies don't have the ability. I'll go back one slide here. Most companies don't have the ability to look for this type of stuff every single day. They don't have the people to actively go in and interpret everything that's happening here on a regular basis, or even build the criteria to go and do those. And that's why managed services are becoming so important. Is being able to leverage a consistent pool of people that are talented and special to be able to go through and do this, then maybe having the entirely dedicated teams in your own environments. It doesn't mean that you can't. What's great is managed EDRs are great for a wide array of different types of sizes of organizations. And so if you look at managed endpoint detection and response, that's really where our space is at Binary Defense. Being able to manage the entire product, not introduce any type of complexity out there, but that's where the market's really heading towards. If you have the ability to augment current staff, or maybe you don't have anybody dedicated to security in the first place, really being able to increase detection almost immediately the minute you install it, and really be able to provide that detection almost immediately. It's actually interesting. I was on a incident response, and we deployed Vision to the customer and saw that they had 16 different types of variations of different types of compromises, everything from Cofter to TrickBot to a number of different other components, just by going and installing these that first day. And so those are the things that managed EDRs help you with, is the augmentation expertise of actually going through and doing analysis for this. And what's interesting too, a good EDR, especially a managed EDR, is going to update your specific environments, or change their techniques or patterns to really start to get better at detection over time. Like a good example is the MAV Inject 32. That was something that we're already detecting on specifically inside of Vision. We didn't need an update our agents or anything else in any way, shape, or form. So it's something that should provide you that immediate visibility. If you didn't know that was even out there, something that you would absolutely go and see real time. And so the whole point is really to detect attacks in the early stages and reduce the impact, the cost, and the risk towards the organization. If you look at the time it takes to respond to a breach, there's a good statistic from the Verizon Data Breach Report that shows that attackers typically have anywhere between a few hours to a few days before they get access to the type of data that they need. And on average, I would say it was more a few days to get access to the data they needed. So if you only have a few days to detect an attacker in your environment, that means that you have to have the right components in place to really minimize the damage to your organization. And those are things that you actively want to be testing every year, more from like an adversarial simulation type of perspective, or a red teaming, to see how well you can respond to specific threats that are targeted towards your organization, and say, hey, what's our detection criteria? Is it right when it happens, an hour, 2 hours later, 6 hours later, 5 days later, 6 months later? What's that time frame? And if we need to get back down to a couple of days of detection criteria, what's that investment look like as far as being able to get that visibility? But endpoint detection and response tools really should gets you there. So that, the ability to do that. And what we do here, we provide a full managed service with our Vision platform. And what's cool with Vision, I'm going to show you a demo here in just a second of it, and really what an EDR should provide for you. What's great with Vision is there's really three big components of it. The first is the detection components, which we talked about. The ability to look for things like past the hash and lateral movement and PowerShell injection and non-PowerShell, methods, golden tickets and everything else that's out there. But that's one component. So that's the detection piece. Also having the ability to do things like containment, take a machine and move it off of the network in the event that it's compromised, so that you can respond faster. If a machine's compromised, you don't want it on the network. That's one thing that you really want to focus on, is taking that machine, moving off the network, and making sure that it can't communicate with anything else on your infrastructure unless you want to remove containment from that system. The third component that is really neat, and I have a lot of fun with this, is part of Vision is also what we call deception. Or canaries, and inside of Vision, we'll do things like inject, clear text passwords into memory, use what's called local linked multicast name resolution protocol, and broadcast credentials through the network. We actually emulate honeypot so that malware gets tricked into thinking that's inside of a cuckoo sandbox or another type of device that will actually shut itself down and not impact the machine. A whole infrastructure built on deception as well, that allows you to really emulate things that only attackers would have the access to go into, so that in the event that, let's just say, something crazy like your detection fails, what can we do to actively go and respond to those specific threats and minimize those and identify those maybe in the later stages of it. So let's go through and do a demo real quick. And I'm not used to Windows very well here, so I'm using Windows as a demo machine. And so let's go and take a look at Vision real quick. And so this is Vision here. Now, from a dashboard perspective, anything can, you can do whatever you need to. But what's nice is, you have a breakdown of assets, alarms. You can do active threat hunting as well, which is really neat. But let's just go real quick and take a look at the alarms. So we go to the alarm section here. We can see that we have all of our different types of alarms, different ways of attackers going in. This is just a demo machine to kind of show you. But what's interesting here, things like not PowerShell. A good example of some of the techniques that are being used right now is that attackers recognize that you have a lot of detection around PowerShell, or at least some of us do. And so what you can do is you can actually call the system management automation.na.dll and the system management automation.dll and actively go and leverage PowerShell. And that means that you can use PowerShell without ever calling PowerShell.exe, and it's a way of getting around normal detection. Privilege escalation, using like name type impersonations. Here's what we talked about before, and I'll show you a couple examples of this from suspicious processes with network connections. But when something like RegSPR32 is beaconing out to the internet, or a new application control bypass is beaconing out to the internet, what does that look like? Suspicious PowerShell commands, you name it. There's a whole set of criteria here, Mimikatz detection, that you can actively go and detect, and these are what EDR should really help provide you to. So if we take a look here. Here's something leveraging, PowerShell, and it's just a command here that was actively being used, but something we should definitely look at. And this one is one of my favorites. If you notice here, we can see that an executable is being executed here, c:\goat.exe, but it's loading in the system management automation.ni.dlls, which is something that we'd want to take a look at, and the host that it's coming from and the process that it's coming from. Definitely be something suspicious as an attacker. From here too, you can see a lot of things like get system or name pipe impersonations. This one was specifically was using Metasploit, but Metasploit isn't the exact. It doesn't matter what the technique is. Things that we definitely want to take a look at. And I'll show you some of the attacks here in a second. Here's leveraging PowerShell injection. Here you can see from PowerShell, and this one triggered based off of a suspicious PowerShell command. So there's a number of different weird indications that you can identify. PowerShell commands with. So, length, way that it's behaving as far as time intervals and things like that, specific commands that are being executed in there. There's a number of ways for us to be able to go and detect those types of things from happening. Here's leveraging Mimikatz. So you see vault flagging imported into a specific executable. There are ways for us to go and actively detect that. So I'm going to show you a couple of videos here of doing live attacks for those specifically. So here's one leveraging social engineering. Let me go to full screen here. So hopefully everybody can see that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to leverage the social engineer toolkit, which obviously it's very easy for me to write detection criteria off of a tool that I wrote. But this is based off of the patterns of how PowerShell injection is working, how HTA downloaders are working, how specific commands are being executed. These are all specific things that we're not building it off of tools. We're building off the patterns of behavior that are being leveraged from the systems in order to get visibility. And so here we're just going to clone Binary Defense as a site. And what's going to happen is it's going to automatically create all of our code in everything that we need to go and leverage. And then we're going to go ahead and launch Metasploit. And Metasploit is going to be our way for our handler. So we're just going to use Metasploit Interpreter as a way for us to get our connection back. So we go over to our Windows machine here. And it's a Windows 10 machine, fully patched and everything else. Running Windows Defender as well as Vision. We go to our site, and it looks like the Binary Defense site in every way. Now we're going to get a prompt to open, and we're going to click Open, and hit Allow, just as a demonstration here. And now we're going to compromise this machine. Now we're going to get a shell that comes out, and it's all going to be through PowerShell. And when we get our connection back, it takes a second, based off everything it's doing. But once we get our connection back, we're going to interact with that shell, and we're going to take a look at what we see. We're going to type get system as well. We'll do that next. You can see here a number of areas were identified. So PowerShell encoded command, PowerShell injection, a number of different techniques are being leveraged. And what's nice about this one is if Vision can detect that it's actually base64 encoded, it will automatically decode all that code for you, so you can do investigations or analysis really quick. Now, what's nice with Vision specifically is that we don't. You don't even have to ever log in your portal. Our analysts do all of the analysis for you. So we'll look at that and say, hey, this is malicious. We're going to notify you and call you. Hey, do we want to move this in containment mode? How do you actively want to go and leverage this? Basically, we manage that whole piece for you. So if it's something that's legitimate, we can baseline it, whitelist it. Again, we handle all that for you, and then you go and do it. So it's nice, from an easy perspective where we can actually go and do it for you. You don't have that burden of having to do the analysis at a given time. Let's take a look at Pass the Hash. So notice here we have 0 alarms open. We're going to use Metasploit again, but again, doesn't matter about the technology that's being leveraged, it's the way that Pass the Hash works. And we're going to use PowerShell injection as our main method. So we're going to target Pass the Hash via PowerShell, and we're going to run. And you'll see here we're going to get access to the machine. All right, we'll go to our Vision box. You see here, we notice the PowerShell commands. We see a service creation because it's how Pass the Hash works in this specific case. And we'll go and take a look at these alarms real quick. So look at this alarm. We can see the actual PowerShell command that was executed. Definitely not looking legitimate in any way, shape, or form. Something we'd want to investigate pretty quickly. We have all of our log data down here, which is really nice. So we can actually break those out and find out what's going on. You can see a Pass the Hash attempt, any relevant security event logs that may help you, determine if you want to do more analysis, and then any raw log data from there and the remote attacker IP addresses. So you get to see everything that happened, directly right there in one central pane. Now, Metasploit specifically will randomize the workstation name, but that's not apparent in everyone, so I wouldn't rely off of that as a good detection criteria. But if you look here, we also needed to create a service in order to get a remote code execution. And here we see the service name and the spot that it dropped it into, and the full command that was executed in order to create that, specific service account itself. And I won't go through all of these, but a lot of good ways. Here's one where maybe catch privilege escalation to go and detect executables too. Vision will automatically disassemble executables and give you all the relevant information to be able to do analysis of the PE files right away. And also supports Linux, OS X, and Windows 2, so it's multiple ones. Here's a good example of suspicious processes. Here we see a PowerShell command that was executed that has network connection. So in case you take a look, like using things like regsvr32, cbd.exe, msbuild.exe, known attack patterns from executables that may have network connections. These are things that we'd want to take a look at and investigate, and obviously this one is not legitimate in any way, shape, or form. But we see this beaconing out what IP address it's beaconing out to, and all that information that gives it to you real time. So just a lot of different ways of actively going and finding things. What's also nice too on the vision piece is if you go to the hunting tab here, you can actually go and do analysis of any ingested data. So you can do hunting exercises based off of anything that we ingest. Every PowerShell command that was executed, command line arguments, service creations, registry hooks, MD5 or SHA hashes of executables, network connections, logged in users, network communications and protocols, process trees. We have all of that specifically within here. And all you need to do is type what you want to look for. And you can see here, if you have script log logging enabled, if you don't, it doesn't matter either. That's in there. But you can see all the commands that have been executed via PowerShell over any given time. You can find what was actually specifically happening in that specific system, what they're actually executing. A way for you to very quickly hunt through information at any given time. So, a very fast way of being able to go and identify specific areas. But again, we support, Linux, OS X, and Windows, and the ability to go and do those 64 and 32-bit. And a way for you to basically go and actively take looks at those real quick. Very fast way of being able to do it. And plus you can move in containment mode as well. So some examples of good detection, and we'll wrap things up here, from the webinar. And if anybody has any questions, pop them in now, and I'll be happy to answer those before those go. If not, then we'll just exit after that. Specifically with good connection types, I think being able to identify suspicious commands and having somebody that can actively go and interpret that data is super important on EDRs. You can go and just buy an EDR tool, but you're not going to have any idea unless you're very well versed in this what that means, or what an application control bypass looks like, or what these types of techniques look like, in order for you to make a determination. So that's some of the biggest challenge that we see on the market, and that's really where we come into play is manage that whole process for our customers. But if you look at things that you can do too, exposing ETW, event log tracing, sysmod's amazing for that. It's a free tool from Microsoft. You can go and download, exposes a lot of those. Looking at suspicious behavior versus technique, or having an understanding of both. Using PowerShell and Coda command is great, but what happens if they don't use that? Being able to look at PowerShell as a method, looking at BB script or direct data types, or I think the DD auto just got patched, but when that came out, having a detection criteria ready for that for remote code execution. Looking at things like Markov chains or deviations from regular processes with executions that are spawning child processes that are unique. That's a big way that you can find a lot of different areas. So looking at regular process execution like RegSVR32. If you're not familiar with that one specifically, I think Casey Smith found that initially, and that has its own built-in browser, which allows you to basically go and download code directly from the internet and execute. Those are things that you definitely want to be looking at. Lateral movement, event log 4624 login type 3, which is network login type. Monitoring those and seeing where people are coming across your infrastructure network with is important. Length of DNS packets, looking at DNS traffic for DNS exfiltration. Having DNS log analysis period is important. And also understanding, what east to west traffic looks like, what Bob's machine in IT or Bob's machine in marketing to Marion IT's machine looks like, and understanding that type of traffic as well as command and control infrastructure is really important out there. So these are just some good detection criteria, and hopefully a lot of you are already doing it. If not, we can definitely help you out on that. But that was really it. That's all I had for the webinar. It was a good hour webinar. Obviously, hopefully you learned a lot from the webinar as far as different ways of doing detection, but also what we're doing here and the fun stuff that we're doing here at Binary Defense. You can always find me at Hacking Dave on Twitter, or at binary_defense. You can always contact us if you're interested. It's info@binarydefense.com. Happy to answer any questions you have or anything like that. That's really as far as the webinar goes. Thank you all for coming. Appreciate it.